then the enemy will come here, and there will be no church. There will be no holy thorn, and the shrine's bishop," he prodded a finger into Sansom's ribs, "will be nothing but dry bones pecked clean by ravens." "There are other ways to keep the enemy from our gates," Sansom said, unwisely hinting that Arthur was the cause of the war, and that if Arthur simply left Dumnonia, then Gorfythyd would be satisfied. Arthur did not become angry. He simply smiled. "Your treasury is needed for Dumnonia, Bishop." "We have no treasury, alas!" Sansom made the sign of the cross. "As God is my witness, Lord, we possess nothing." I strolled across to the thorn. "The monks of Ivinium," I said, referring to a monastery some miles to the south, "are better gardeners than you, Bishop." I scraped Howlbane from her scabbard and prodded her tip into the soil beside the sorry tree. "Maybe we should dig up the holy thorn and take it to Ivinium's care. I'm sure their monks would pay highly for the privilege." "And the thorn would be further from the Saxons," Arthur said brightly. "Surely you approve of our plan, Bishop?" Sansom was waving his hands desperately. "The monks at Ivinium are ignorant fools, Lord, mere mumblers of prayers. If your lordships would wait in the church, maybe I can find some few coins for your purpose." "Do," Arthur said. The three of us were ushered into the church. It was a plain building with a stone floor, stone walls, and a beamed roof. It was a gloomy place, for only a little light came through the small high windows where sparrows bickered and wallflowers grew. At the church's far end was a stone table, on which stood a crucifix. Nimue, the hood thrown back from her hair, spat at the crucifix, while Arthur strolled to the table, then hitched himself up so he could sit on its edge. "I take no pleasure in this, Derval," he said. "Why should you, Lord?" "It does not do to offend gods," Arthur said gloomily.
"This god," Nimue said contemptuously, "is said to be a forgiving one. Better offend that kind than any other."
Arthur smiled. He was wearing a simple jerkin, trousers, boots, a cloak, and Excalibur. He wore no gold, nor armour, but there was no mistaking his authority, nor, at that moment, his unease. He sat in silence for a time, then looked up at me. Nimue was exploring the small rooms at the back of the church, and we were alone together. "Perhaps I should leave Britain," Arthur said. "And yield Dumnonia to Gorfythyd?" "Gorfythyd will enthrone Mordred in time," Arthur said, "and that is all that matters." "He says as much?" I asked. "He does." "And what else would he say?" I argued, appalled that my lord should even contemplate exile. "But the truth," I added forcefully, "is that Mordred will be Gorfythyd's client. And why should Gorfythyd enthrone a client? Why not put one of his own relatives on the throne? Why not put his son Keenaglas on our throne?" "Keenaglas is honourable," Arthur insisted. "Keenaglas will do whatever his father tells him," I said scornfully. "And Gorfythyd wants to be High King, which means he certainly won't want the old High King's heir growing to be a rival. Besides, do you think Gorfythyd's druids will let a maimed king live? If you go, Lord, I number Mordred's days." Arthur did not respond. He sat there, his hands on the table's edge and his head down as he stared at the floor. He knew I was right, just as he knew that he alone of Britain's warlords fought for Mordred. The rest of Britain wanted their own man on Dumnonia's throne, while Guinevere wanted Arthur himself to sit there. He looked up at me. "Did Guinevere—" he began. "Yes," I interrupted him bleakly. I had supposed he was referring to Guinevere's ambition to place him on Dumnonia's throne, but he had been thinking of another matter entirely. He jumped off the table and began pacing up and down. "I understand your feelings for Lancelot," he said, surprising me, "but consider this, Derval. Suppose that Benwick had been your kingdom, and supposing that you believed I would save it for you. Indeed, you knew that I was oath-bound to save it, and then I did not, and Benwick was destroyed. Would that not make you bitter? Would it not make you distrustful? King Lancelot has suffered greatly, and the suffering was at my hands. Mine. And I want, if I can, to make his losses good. I can't recapture Benwick, but I can perhaps give him another kingdom. Which? I asked. He smiled slyly. He had the whole scheme worked out, and he was taking an immense pleasure in revealing it to me. Siluria, he said. Let us suppose we can defeat Gorfithid, and with him Gunlius. Gunlius has no heir, Derval, so if we can kill Gunlius, a throne is vacant. We have a king without a throne. They have a throne without a king. More, we have an unmarried king. Offer Lancelot as husband to Cynwyn, and Gorfithid will have his daughter as a queen, and we shall have our friend on the Silurian throne. Peace, Derval. He spoke with all his old enthusiasm, building a wonderful vision with his words. A union. The marriage union I never made, but now we can make it again. Lancelot and Cynwyn. And to achieve it, we only need to kill one man. Just one. And as many other men who needed to die in battle, I thought, but said nothing. Somewhere to the north a rumble of thunder sounded. The god Tyrannus was aware of us, I thought, and I hoped he was on our side. The sky through the tiny high windows was black as night. Well? Arthur pressed me. I had not spoken because the thought of Lancelot wedding Cynwyn was so bitter that I could not trust myself to speak. But now I forced myself to sound civil. We have to buy off the Saxons and defeat Gorfithid first, I said sourly. But if we do? He asked impatiently, as though my objections were trivial obstacles. I shrugged, as though the idea of the marriage was far beyond my competency to judge. Lancelot likes the idea, Arthur said, and his mother does too. Guinevere approves as well, but then she would, because it was her idea to marry Cynwyn to Lancelot in the first place. She's a clever girl. Very clever. He smiled, as he always did when he thought of his wife. But even your clever wife, Lord, I dared to say, cannot dictate Mithras's adherence. He jerked his head, as though I had struck him. Mithras, he said angrily. Why can't Lancelot join? Because he's a coward, I snarled, unable to hide my bitterness any longer. Bors says not. So do a dozen other men, Arthur challenged me. Ask Galahad, I said, or your cousin Killock. Rain sounded sudden on the roof, and a moment later began to drip from the high window-sills. Nimue had reappeared in the small arched door beside the stone table, where she pulled the hood over her face again. If Lancelot proves himself, will you relent? Arthur asked me after a while. If Lancelot shows himself to be a fighter, Lord, I shall relent. But I thought he was your palace guard now. His wish is to command in Durnovaria only until his wounded hand heals, Arthur explained. But if he does fight Derval, then will you elect him? If he fights well, I promised reluctantly. Yes. I was fairly sure it was a promise I would never have to keep. Good, Arthur said, pleased as always to have found a measure of agreement. Then he turned as the church door banged open with a gust of rainy wind, and Sansom ran inside, followed by 2 monks. The 2 monks were carrying leather bags. Very small leather bags. Sansom shook water off his robe as he hurried up the church. We have searched, Lord, he said breathlessly. We have hunted, we have pecked high and low, and we have assembled what little treasures our poultry house possesses, which treasures we now lay before you in humble but reluctant duty. He shook his head sadly. We shall go hungry this season as a result of our generosity, but where a sword commands, we mere servants of God must obey. His monks poured the contents of the 2 bags onto the flagstones. A coin rolled across the floor until I trapped it with my foot. Gold! From the Emperor Hadrian, Sansom said of the coin. I picked it up. It was a brass sesterce with the Emperor Hadrian's head on one side and an image of Britannia with her trident and shield on the other. I bent the coin double between my finger and thumb and tossed it to Sansom. "Fool's gold, Bishop," I said. The rest of the treasure was not much better. There were some worn coins, mostly copper, with a few of silver, some iron bars that were commonly used as currency, a brooch of poor gold, and some thin golden links from a broken chain. The whole collection was perhaps worth 12 gold pieces. "Is this all?" Arthur asked.
"We gave it to the poor, lord," Sansom said. "Though, if your needs are pressing, then maybe I could add this."
He lifted the golden cross from around his neck. The heavy cross and its thick chain were easily worth 40 or 50 gold pieces, and now, reluctantly, the bishop held them out to Arthur.
"My personal loan for your war, lord," he suggested.
Arthur reached for the chain, and Sansom immediately jerked it back.
"Lord,"
he dropped his voice so that only Arthur and I could hear him,
"I was unjustly treated last year. For the loan of this chain,"
he twitched it so that the heavy links clinked together,
"I would demand that my appointment as King Mordred's personal chaplain be honoured. My place is at the king's side, lord, not here in this pestilential marshland."
Before Arthur could respond, the door of the church opened once again, and a rain-soaked Issa shambled inside. Sansom turned furiously on the newcomer.
"The church is not open to pilgrims," the bishop snapped. "There are regular services. Now get out! Out!"
Issa pushed wet hair away from his face, grinned, and spoke to me.
"They hide all their goods beside the pond, behind the big house, lord. All of it under a pile of rocks. I watched them put today's tribute there."
Arthur plucked the heavy chain from Sansom's hand. "You may keep those other treasures." He gestured at the shabby collection on the floor. "To feed your paltry house through the winter, Bishop. And keep your talk as a reminder that your neck is in my gift." He strode towards the door.
"Lord!"
Sansom shouted in protest.
"I beg you!"
"Beg?" Nimue interrupted him, pushing the hood back from her face.
"Beg, you dog!"
She turned and spat on the crucifix, then onto the church floor, then a third time at Sansom.
"Beg, you piece of dirt!"
she snarled at him.
"Dear God!"
Sansom blanched at the sight of his enemy. He reeled backward, making the sign of the cross on his thin chest. For a moment he seemed too terrified to even speak. He must have thought Nimue lost forever on the Isle of the Dead. Yet here she was, spitting in triumph. He crossed himself a third time, then wheeled on Arthur.
"You dare bring a witch into God's house!"
he screamed.
"This is sacrilege! Oh, sweet Christ!"
He dropped to his knees and gazed up at the rafters.
"Cast fire from heaven! Cast it now!"
Arthur ignored him, plunging instead into the pelting rain that was bedraggling the pathetic votive ribbons draped on the holy thorn. "Call the other spearmen inside," Arthur ordered Issa. My men had waited outside the shrine in case Sansom had attempted to hide his treasures beyond the encircling wall, but now the spearmen came into the enclosure to help drive the frantic monks away from the pile of rocks that hid their secret treasury. Some of the monks dropped to their knees as they saw Nimue. They knew who she was. Sansom ran from the church and threw himself onto the rocks, dramatically decreeing that he would sacrifice his life to preserve God's money. Arthur shook his head sadly. "Are you sure of this sacrifice, Lord Bishop?"
"Dear sweet God!"
Sansom bellowed.
"Thy servant comes, slaughtered by wicked men and their foul witch. All I did was obey your word. Receive me, Lord. Receive thy humble servant."
This was followed by a scream as he anticipated his death, but it was only Issa lifting him by the scruff of his neck and the seat of his robe and carrying him gently away from the stone pile to the pond, where he dropped Sansom into the shallow, muddy water.
"I'm drowning, Lord!"
Sansom shouted.
"Cast into mighty waters like Jonah into the ocean.